So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for coming to this panel discussion and event, which marks the start of Lancet Migration, a global collaboration to advance migration health. We have some of the top migration health experts joining us to speak today. The keynote speeches and the two panel discussions will focus on both the challenges and opportunities in migration and health globally, as well as the goals and opportunities for Lancet Migration itself. So why are we here today to speak about migration and health? Humans have been on the move for millennia, and migration is part of our global reality and future. The impact of the migration process on health is very much a key global public health issue. However, what we know as academics, as practitioners, as humanitarians, is that migrants are often left behind and increasingly excluded from health services and policies. We strongly believe that a stronger evidence base and more effective collaboration between policy, academia, and civil society is urgently needed to improve the lives of all migrants. And Lancet Migration aims to meet this need. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the first of our excellent speakers today, Dr. Richard Horton, Editor-in-Chief of The Lancet, who is one of the foremost champions of global health. In recognition of this, in 2019, he was awarded the WHO Director General's Health Leaders Award for outstanding leadership in global health. So please welcome Dr. Richard Horton.
Thanks so much. Welcome everybody to a very exciting afternoon. I'm just going to have a few prefatory remarks before the main event, which is Martin. But I do want to say something, because this is not just a global collaboration to advance migration health. This has got the name Lancet Migration attached to it. So I do want to just say a few words about our reflections on this afternoon. The idea that human beings are reshaping the contours of life, all life, not just human life, and indeed the possibility of that life on our planet, is what we've come to know as the Anthropocene. But when we discuss the Anthropocene, it's sometimes a common mistake that we assume that the human actions that are contributing to those changes to our planet are taking place in or through a series of fixed and unchanging entities, whether they be countries or cities or communities or families. We certainly acknowledge the force of people and of population growth, but we too often pay rather less attention to the flow of people and populations. And yet it is actually the flow of people that is having far greater political impact and reach. Migration is, well, you wouldn't be here if you didn't believe it, one of the, if not the most potent and divisive political issues of our day. As Martin and I and some of you in this audience saw last night at our Global Health Lab at the London School of Hygiene on populism and global health, migration is one of the main reasons for the emergence and, unfortunately, the expansion and expression of political populism around the world today. What do we mean by populism? Populism, the idea of a pure and virtuous people somehow uniting against a corrupt establishment elite. It's become a very powerful mobilizing force in many of our communities. It is nothing less than a nativism, where for people, one should read a particular ethnic or religious grouping. Migration is a powerful political force then, because it has given permission to political parties, old and newer political parties, and especially to parties of the radical right, to burnish their populist credentials, to demonize what are portrayed as undeserving foreigners, to create hostile environments, to erode the rights of minorities, to foster fears of a swarm, as David Cameron once called it, or an invasion, to use systems of social protection as systems of social exclusion and control. The political weaponization of migration is a threat, therefore, to ideas of universality, equity, and justice, ideas that are central to our concerns with health and health care. According to the International Organization for Migration, there are something like 272 million international migrants, people living in a country other than their own. And the IOM, in every report every year, always emphasizes what a small number that is. They emphasize that it's only 3.5% of the world's population. But 272 million people is still, remember, over half, now well over half after January the 31st this year, of the European Union. That still seems to me a very large number. And please consider the trajectory of migration. The highest number of internally displaced persons from violence and conflict on record today, over 40 million people. The increasing impact of a growing environmental crisis that could, by the end of this century, yield 1 billion climate refugees. The rising importance of food insecurity for migrants. The gradual feminization of the labour migrant workforce. And we're living in an era of coronavirus. 5 million people migrated out of Wuhan in the space of a few weeks, and many others in China did the same. The dimensions of infectious disease epidemics and global health security is an issue of migration and health. One final observation. Last month we announced the launch of a campaign this year for global child and adolescent health. We're going to kick off that campaign in just a few weeks in Geneva with the launch of a commission on children and adolescents. Children and young people are one of the most marginalized and invisibilized groups in migration and health. Although a fifth of international migrants are children and young people up to the age of 18 or 19, when you look at the refugee population of around 25, 26 million people, over half of refugees are under the age of 18 years. Refugee health has a child's face. We always say at the Lancet that we want our commissions to be more than simply a report that sits on a library shelf or that is on a website. We want our commissions to be living entities where we put evidence to good work. And I want to thank the Chair of the Commission, Ibrahim Abu Bakr, and particularly also the Executive Director of Lancet Migration, Miriam Orcutt, for their unstinting work in the last 18 months in taking the recommendations of the Commission and turning it into this remarkable opportunity to see evidence as a platform for advocacy and social action. We will be a partner standing side by side with you in this work in the coming years, and for us, this is a very exciting day. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Richard, for those inspiring words and your presence here today. I would now like to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Martin McKee, who is Professor of European Public Health and Medical Director at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He is also Research Director of the European Observatory on Health Systems and Policies.
Thank you, Richard, for such an inspirational talk. Well, all of us here today are on a journey. And sometimes that journey involves traveling through space from one country to another. It always involves traveling across time, building on our experiences and changing our views and adapting our roles. I want to begin with my journey. My journey from clinical medicine to public health began in Belfast in the early 1980s. As a medical registrar, I was awarded a research fellowship to study obscure aspects of peptide biochemistry. But at the same time, I was seeing patients from some of the most deprived parts of Western Europe. And among them, in the 1980s in Belfast, there were people with scurvy and beriberi. And this was the stimulus for me to move from clinical medicine into public health. I came to London, I learned epidemiology, and I moved on the journey from individuals to populations. And when I moved in that way, I shifted my focus from what was inside the bodies of those individuals, revealed by X-rays or by endoscopes, to what was outside, seeking to understand the conditions in which they lived, loved, worked, and played. Well, Belfast in the 1980s had very few migrants. Let's face it, it wasn't the most exciting place to be. The city closed down at 6 o'clock every evening. There were a small number of Chinese restaurants, and as far as I can recall, one Indian restaurant and one Italian restaurant. If you saw a non-white person, they were very likely a doctor, usually from the Indian subcontinent, or one of a handful of recruits to the clergy. And I remember some years later being very impressed when the Bishop of Gujarat, who I met, described in detail his obscure, the obscure villages of County Antrim, displaying pronunciation skills that were far beyond those of the BBC newsreaders during the Troubles. And of course there was the violence. Why would anyone in their right mind who had managed to escape one conflict zone move voluntarily to another? But Northern Ireland did have a link with migration. Northern Ireland was a source of migrants because for almost 2 centuries my compatriots had moved to other parts of the empire and to the United States. So none of us are divorced from the issue of migration. Well, all of this has changed, and Northern Ireland is at peace. Well, sort of at peace. It now is somewhere that people from the rest of the world actually want to come to. There are many opportunities, for example, in the agri-food sector. Young people from Northern Ireland seeking their fortunes in London or New York are being replaced by Poles, Lithuanians, Nigerians, and a surprisingly large number of Brazilians. And Northern Ireland still remains a source of migrants, not just the young people looking for opportunities elsewhere, but also, in a change from the past, their parents or grandparents retiring to Spain or Portugal. And again, we've already had reference to it, but unlike those of you in the rest of the United Kingdom as you age, at least we will still have the freedom of movement with our Irish passports. Now, these changes have not always been smooth. A few years ago, my daughter, a postdoctoral research fellow here at UCL in the Constitution Unit, analysed data from the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey. The Good Friday Agreement had brought Northern Irish people together across the religious divide. But some people always need someone else to blame for their misfortune. And she showed how the new others were the growing number of migrants, especially from Eastern Europe or from countries that were predominantly Muslim. So why am I telling you this? What can a small province of 1.7 million people tell us about global migration? Well, the first thing is that, as I tried to make clear, the world is changing. Only 30 years ago, it would have been unimaginable that there would ever be significant numbers of migrants coming to Northern Ireland. And the second is that there are many types of migrants. They're not just the people who move from poor countries to rich ones. The Northern Irish middle class have retired to the golf courses of southern Portugal, and they are migrants too. It's just that we use a different language to describe them because we call them expats. But that does not change who they are. But there's a third reason, and that is more personal. My own journey from clinical medicine to public health has involved a shift from people to numbers. Essentially, in much of my work, I count people or communities. Even in the work that we do in the global burden of disease, for example, and other projects, we have entire countries that are represented as dots on a scatter plot. Yet my experience in the Royal Victoria Hospital has never left me, and I can never forget that behind the individuals are individual people. So who are these people? Well, let me introduce you to two people whose lives came together in circumstances that neither could ever have predicted. Antonis Deligeorgis was a sergeant in the Greek army. Antonis was dived into the sea to rescue Wagasi Nebiat, a 24-year-old Eritrean. And here you can see him dragging her onto the beach. She was one of 93 people on a makeshift boat that foundered on the rocks of Rhodes. She was one of many thousands of people who have fled a country that has become infamous for enforced labour, arbitrary arrests, torture and disappearances. A country whose president said that if there is anyone who thinks that there can be democracy in this country, then they can think such things in another world. But Wagasi was one of the lucky ones. She was lucky at least twice. First, her family had saved enough to pay the people smugglers $10,000, a fortune, to get her on a plane from Khartoum to Istanbul. Many others trek through war zones or across the Sahara with the ever-present threat of death from the harsh climate or from the criminals who exploit them. And second, she survived. She survived the Mediterranean, unlike tens of thousands who have not. And the other person who you all know was Aylan Kurdi. Only one of them, and as the then French Prime Minister reminded us, he was not a number. He too had a name. Now, I'm sure everyone in this room knows these stories. They both attracted attention in the media in this country, at least for those of us who read The Guardian, and in many countries worldwide. Many of those of you who work with migrants will have similar stories to tell. Some of you may be able to speak from personal experience of migrating. But, more importantly, all of you have come together today because you believe that what you have seen and what you have read about is not inevitable. People should not be forced from their homes. And if they do, then they should have the right to be treated with decency. But sadly, this is often not the case. You're all familiar with the horror stories of those who have made it to what they believe to be safety in countries like the United Kingdom or the United States. The editorial on Friday's Lancet that launched this collaboration told another story, that of Carlos Gregorio Hernandez Vasquez, a Guatemalan teenager who died in a US detention cell where his illness was ignored. In this country, we have heard the seemingly endless stories of those who have fallen foul of what the previous government called the hostile environment. Some, as we now know, had every right to be here, the Windrush generation, but they simply got caught out by not having the right papers. And once they got caught up in a cruel, Kafkaesque immigration system, it was almost impossible to escape from it. What we have seen over the last few years, and in these slides, is justification in itself for us coming together today in this collaboration. But this group is especially important because it is now very obvious that things are getting worse. And Richard has referred to it, our Global Health Lab last night. Populist politicians in the United States, in Hungary, in Brazil, are openly stirring up hatred of migrants. In the United Kingdom, their language is more subtle, but for some, their coded words are easily deciphered. The discourse that was used to justify Brexit has legitimized racism and xenophobia. Some perpetrators of Islamophobic attacks have drawn their inspiration directly from the words of our current Prime Minister. And as this notice, which some of you will have seen, illustrates, for many in this country, taking back control of our borders simply means sending foreigners back. Now, another reason why things are going to get worse is that a growing number of parts of our world are simply uninhabitable. We know, for example, that the drought in eastern Syria in the 2000s was a major contributor to the conflict that now ravages that country, and we have a colleague who is originally from Syria among us today, and there may be others. It wasn't the only reason, of course. The plentiful supply of weapons from neighbouring Iraq and the competition for political influence in an unstable region also played a role. But the mass movement of impoverished people from rural areas into the cities contributed significantly to the conflict that follows. And in the last few years, we've seen parts of northeastern India and the Arabian Peninsula where a combination of heat and humidity make it impossible to survive. And meanwhile, the Amazon is on fire, encouraged by the Brazilian President Bolsonaro. Zambia and its neighbours are in the midst of a profound drought. Changed weather conditions have created the condition for swarms of locusts in Kenya. But it's not just the tropics. Smoke fires from fires in Australia have turned the day into night, while freak weather conditions have brought massive hailstones. Yet, despite the evidence staring him in the face, Scott Morrison, or as he's now more commonly known, Scotty from marketing, the Australian Prime Minister, in this parody feed, Twitter feed, remains in complete denial. Now, we have yet to see rivers teeming with frogs, although the unseasonal cold in Florida, as you know, has meant that frozen iguanas are falling from the trees, which is pretty close to that. But otherwise, it now seems like we have a reenactment of almost all of the biblical plagues. And yet, we have politicians failing to take any notice. The Australian writer Thomas Keneally has said that the very question of the habitability of Australia now stares us in the face. The simple reality is that large parts of our planet are becoming impossible to live in. So for these reasons, it's entirely fitting that the Lancet Migration has selected climate change as one of its two priorities. But its other one is also very important, and that is universal health care. The governments of the world have committed to achieving universal health care in the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is something that we must never let them forget. We have to hold them to account. We in civil society, and I include academia and the Lancet, have a key role in doing this. They have committed. We must not allow them to ignore their commitments. And the Lancet has a proud tradition of doing this. In many areas, speaking truth to power, counting down the numbers, counting the bodies, and reminding politicians of their commitments. But too often, we allow our politicians to redefine the word universal. A British health minister once said that we had a national health service and not an international one. It was a cheap and pathetic attempt to divert attention from his own failings. Universal means universal, neither more nor less. This is not Lewis Carroll where Humpty Dumpty could use a word in whatever way he wanted it to mean. But over recent years, we've seen the NHS in England make it even more difficult for some groups among us to receive the care they need. And I want to pay tribute to my colleague Lou Hyam, who has really done a huge amount of work here. And also in her work with organisations like Doctors of the World, who have contributed to filling this gap. But the challenges are enormous. Quite literally, in this country, people are dying because of the inability to access healthcare in what we are told is one of the richest countries in the world and which is being made great again. Well, the Lancet Migration collaboration starts with a high level of ambition. It seeks to improve the health of everyone, whether they are those who migrate, those who are left behind, or those who share a space with either group. Now, in this brief talk, I've tried to focus on some of the challenges, but please, we must never forget that there are many examples of good practice and of good people, including all of you here today, people who really care. And in closing, although I am a Northern Irish Protestant by background, I would like to leave you with the words of another migrant, a migrant to Europe, one of the better known ones. When the stranger in our midst appeals to us, we must not repeat the sins and errors of the past. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite the next panel up, please. So this is our first panels focusing on Lancet Migration and some of the goals and opportunities for this collaboration.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you everyone who's joined us. I'm Jocelyn Clark from the Lancet, and absolutely delighted to be here today with all of you and all of you on the live stream. It's my pleasure and my privilege to chair our first panel today, which is going to introduce you to Lancet Migration. And as Richard Horton said in his opening remarks, this is a very, very exciting day for us at the Lancet, in particular because we were just so pleased to have been heavily involved in the UCL-Lancet Commission on Migration and Health, and delighted since its publication, which many of you will have received when you came in today, that it has evolved and developed into this new global collaboration called Lancet Migration, which will continue the path of the Commission in being a remarkable opportunity to use evidence to stimulate advocacy and action in this space. So thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Professor Ibrahim Abubakar, who's a professor in infectious disease epidemiology and the head of the Institute for Global Health here at UCL, who served as the chair of our UCL-Lancet Commission and the chair of our new Lancet Migration collaboration. To his left is Professor Bernadette Kumar, who's a professor of the Empower School of Health in India and the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, and she serves as a co-chair of Lancet Migration. And to her left is Professor Terry McGovern, who's the Halburn Professor and Chair of the Halburn Department of Population and Family Health at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health in New York. And to her left, Professor Paul Spiegel, who's professor of the practice at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and he's director of the Hopkins Center for Humanitarian Health, also serving as a co-chair of Lancet Migration. So our goals in this panel are to explain to our audience what Lancet Migration is, all the work that's been done to develop the plan for this collaboration, and to describe some of the ambition and vision going forward. So I'll start with you, Ibrahim. If you could, please, explain to the audience what Lancet Migration is and what its main goals are, but in particular how it builds on the commission that you led for UCL and Lancet that we published back in December 2018.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. So I suppose I'll start with what it isn't, because I can see many academic colleagues that have that work in migration and health. And if you're here because you thought we are launching a new Lancet journal, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We are not a journal. We are a group of researchers, implementers that are passionate about this subject that will come together, and we're collaborating across the planet with the journal The Lancet to produce the evidence base to meet some of the gaps we identified in the UCL-Lancet Commission that we published in 2018 December. And our idea is that we look at specific areas where there is a need for novel work, not to duplicate the work of others, but to complement all the existing amazing work that others are doing in this space, and to use this evidence to essentially advance policy, to advocate for change in the relevant areas in the wide subject of migration and health. We are clear that we have a role to play in this space because migration is an issue that affects all of us, whether you are a migrant yourself or whether you host migrants or you are left behind by others that have moved. It's been a part of humanity and will continue to be so and will remain a defining issue of our time. In formulating what we do, we are also clear that we cannot do everything ourselves, so we set up a process that would allow us to identify the key topics that we'd work on to fit some of the gaps that we've identified. And Martin has already alluded to, in the first year, we have strategically chosen two really important areas, universal health coverage, as well as climate change, as vertical strands where we'll produce outputs. Within those areas, my colleagues would describe to you in a bit more detail what priorities we would take forward in the first year. But we also know that it's important to look at certain horizontal themes that will remain relevant through the course of our work. The first one is around gender, and we think gender is very important because gender affects all of the dimensions we'd ever look at. We also believe that it's important to have data, good quality data, and meet some of the gaps that we outlined in the Commission report. And finally, we believe that the different drivers of migration, whether one is forced to leave or whether one leaves to get a job elsewhere or a mixture of the two, are important considerations. We came by these priorities by having consultations beyond our commissioners, by speaking to a wide range of people, culminating in a meeting last year, generously hosted by the University of Gießen. I acknowledge Michael Knieper in the audience, which over a few days we spoke to a wide range of people and came up with these priorities through a consensus-building approach. And we believe that we have set the scene for us to generate the evidence-based to impact policy.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I mean, perhaps it's a moment to sort of reflect and acknowledge the very global, if you will, set of commissioners that worked on our first project together, and for you to say a few words about how the sort of working model of this new initiative will entail really keeping the collaboration global, but also tapping into the work that's going on around the world. How did that play into the priorities for this group moving forward?
So migration and health, despite some of the doom and gloom you would hear, is a community that is full of really amazing individuals. I've encountered over the last 4 years that I've been in this space, individuals that work in the most difficult places in the world, making a huge difference. And our idea is actually to build on the work we have done and the work others are doing elsewhere. And whether you're an implementer or a researcher, we would hope that going forward, you would find the opportunity to engage us and collaborate. The way we've set up the system is that we'll build on our existing commissioner model by organizing ourselves into working groups. And then we would use those working groups to draft the outputs that I've referred to earlier. This model is what allowed us to convene in the first place the meeting I described, which we use to form the priorities, and is the same approach that we will use going forwards to set up areas of expertise and go into depth to generate the evidence and to disseminate it and advocate for policy change.
Thank you. So Bernadette, maybe I could ask you next. So I think most people will recognize that the main thrust, if you will, of the Commission and now its afterlife in the form of Lancet Migration is very heavily focused on research and the generation of best evidence to inform the development of a very healthy policy course. Can you talk to us a bit about how that works, how the generation of evidence can then drive this advocacy and action that we've been talking about, and the kind of collaborations that are required in order for us as mostly researchers to be plugging into the right policy, implementation, operational, et cetera, kind of networks.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Ibrahim has really covered very nicely the what and the why, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the who and the how, the more difficult ones, I think. But the who and the how is so essential. So in a way, the who was established during the commission, and it was this nucleus, the core group, and it was a core group of researchers and academics, but from different disciplines as well. And also we were from different parts of the world. And I think some of those core values and core characteristics will continue. But the main shift and what will be different is, because it is people and it is about, the collaboration is about bringing people together, that there will be some differences. And you can ask me what will be different. So what will be different is really in this work that we go beyond our comfort zone. So it's not only about working with those who we know and who we have worked with, but it's also to link and expand beyond health to politics, economics, armed conflict, climate change, etc. So that is really taking it to one step further. Then it's about, we all talk about multisectoral, intersectoral, interdisciplinary approaches, and it's almost become like an alphabet soup. But I think the main thing here is how do we put that into practice? And that's also going to be another dimension of this collaboration, that we actually have that. Then it's about expanding, and even though we're in the Great Britain, beyond the mainly English-speaking European American context. It's about, we do talk about the Global South, but it's actually realizing that and getting to the Global South. It's about prioritizing high-burden countries in this collaboration and bringing them on board. It's about having people who are in charge of implementation and not only generating the evidence. And unless people in charge of implementation and working with implementation are there, we can't take it forward. It's about having the stronger migrant voices, the voices of users, of civil society. And even though there is always the intention to do this, it's actually bringing that to fruition that is really the challenge. And this is going to be one of our, it's very ambitious, but getting there. And to have a balance, because I think it's about balance. And even though it may seem very ambitious, and it is ambitious, it's really trying to strike that balance of local, regional, global, discipline, technical areas, the different interests. So this is going to be very important in the people who are there. And then you can say, my goodness, how on earth are you going to do all of this? And the idea is not to try and do everything in one go, but try to work through the thematic areas that Ibrahim has already mentioned, and I think Terry and Paul will talk a little bit more in depth about that, but having regional hubs, and in the regional hubs actually building on the networks that have been established and trying to also explore those networks further so that there is a sustainability, so this is able to continue. And so these will be two of ways we work. And given that this is climate change, we're not proposing and planning to have a lot of face-to-face meetings, but trying to use sort of platforms that are web-based or Skype and sort of communicate with each other in many different ways. And we also want to have people on board who are interested. So it's not only about having, the regional hubs or the working groups, but it's also about having everybody who's engaged about migration and wants to be engaged, and having them through mailing lists and through having a newsletter, etc. So a lot of this at the moment is work in progress. So I can't claim to say that we have all the answers and we've really got all the blueprints in place, but it's going to be work that we need to build on. And we're building on the Commission's work in taking this forward. So I hope I was able to give you an idea of things to come and how we plan to work. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernadette. I mean, it's a fascinating evolution, because actually when this report was put together, the original UCL-Lancet Commission, it built on the work of a core group of 20 commissioners who were sat around the world, but nevertheless were quite a small group using their existing networks. And here we have, I think we're hearing from you, a very ambitious, but also very inclusive process. So for those of you who are wondering at the moment how you might get involved, we'll be able to talk about that a little later during the Q&A. But if you follow the group's Twitter feed or go to the website that's up on the screen, there'll be opportunities to engage with the group and signal your interest. And we're, of course, very, very interested to have as much involvement as possible. So to pivot a little bit back to the content of the strategic vision, if you will, of the Commission, or of Lancet Migration, we've heard that one of the cross-cutting themes is gender. And I think this is really interesting because when we did the Commission, gender was kind of poking around the sidelines. It was sort of everywhere but nowhere. But by the end of that 2 or 3 year process, it became very clear that almost every aspect of the migration journey, and indeed of the accumulation of evidence and analysis, was highly gendered. And so I'm sure people are delighted to hear this is going to be one of the cross-cutting themes. So could I ask you, Terry, to build that out a little bit more for our audience? Why does gender matter to migration and health?
Thank you, Jocelyn. Richard, UCL. I'm glad to be here. So female migrants are slightly less than half. It depends on the type of migration. If we're talking about labor, we see more men. Domestic workers, we see more women and girls. But they face a unique discrimination, gender-based discrimination, violence, interpersonal, sexual violence. We need data that is sex disaggregated. It's often not collected. It's really the first step in understanding migration and gender. So for example, the World Bank migrant remittance database is not disaggregated. So it's very difficult to extract gender inequalities. We need longitudinal migration and data research that is linked to structural determinants. For example, in sexual and reproductive health, most of the research is post-migration, which it therefore has a lot of assumptions. If you don't understand what was happening where people came from, then you're going to miss a lot of things of what's actually happening. Of course, gender-based violence in the humanitarian context, a meta-analysis showed 21% of women and girls had experienced gender-based violence. There's kind of an emphasis on non-partner violence in the funding and research, and partner violence is a huge issue. In the gender-based violence area, we have very little research on prevention, on traditional harmful practices, on how law is being applied. And I want to talk for a minute about sexual and reproductive health and rights. So the Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Services of my country on January 16th pulled together 35 countries to organize a meeting the day before the World Health Assembly to figure out a way to strip international agreements of language around sexual and reproductive health. Invoking Eleanor Roosevelt and the Atlantic Charter, he spoke of the human rights of the unborn and national sovereignty rights around deciding these issues. Now, this is quite something for me to read because we do a lot of research on the global gag rule and how the U.S. is putting funding restrictions that are tearing health systems apart. So in this extremely bad context of sexual and reproductive health, lack of access, misapplication of law, lack of access to abortion, even in the context of sexual violence, we have an increasingly difficult political environment. So of course, women who are migrating and girls will bear the brunt of this because we still had such challenges even before the entire world started coming together to deny people's human rights. Just a word on climate change. We've seen, and particularly I worked in post-Maria, we've seen an increase in climate emergencies and femicides, in gender-based violence, and very little planning that has to do with all of these issues, including the very emergency kind of sexual and reproductive health services that need to be available when there's no electricity. So I think all of these issues are very present in the climate change discussion and should be prioritized. So thank you.
Thank you, Terry. I mean, if we thought migration and health in general was politicized, when we begin to layer on a kind of gender analysis, it becomes even more urgent. You know, the kind of interdisciplinary ways we need to look at this issue, even for a group of, you know, largely health scientists. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure we could spend the whole day almost, and really just delighted that there's a cross-cutting theme on this new project looking at gender. And to you next, Paul. On top of all of that, a key priority is the engagement of the civil society, which is absolutely necessary for this group to reach its goals. How will Lancet Migration do that, and what kind of organizations is it important for this group to engage with in terms of the civil society space?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for UCL, and particularly Ibrahim and Miriam for all of your hard work and the Lancet. We've done a lot of work at the global level thus far, I would say, working at the World Health Assembly, at the UN General Assembly, trying to at least advocate for even just the words migration in some of these documents. But in order to make a difference, we're going to have to obviously work at not just the regional level, but at the national levels, working with civil society, both faith-based, of course, international and national non-governmental organizations. Like many components, migration, whether it be forced migration, labor, undocumented, it's very, very context specific. It depends on national laws, depends on different existing health systems, how they can access, how migrants are or not able to work and then have money and then try to access systems. And so it'll be, for all of the research, it'll be incumbent upon us to be able to work with these particular groups. For example, when we looked at just a very simple example, it's more from my background in terms of refugees. When you look at how refugees integrate or do not integrate into health systems in Lebanon compared to Jordan, Lebanon is a very privatized system, very, very expensive. Jordan is not. And so it really, how we want to go about integrating refugees into these systems is completely different. I was back recently from Colombia, where we were looking at Venezuelan refugees or migrants, looking at HIV and how actually those that have HIV are on antiretroviral therapy, but could not at the time receive antiretroviral therapy from Venezuela. And those that were able to get an agreement with the government, a certain paper, were able to access the national systems. Those that were not, you had to have an NGO, AIDS Healthcare Foundation, to actually start and provide antiretrovirals with a different system. It's very, very complex. The second area that I'd like to, in terms of broad civil society, will be media, and it was discussed, both Richard and Martin, how to work with the media and to try to use evidence to address the huge amount of misinformation and deliberate disinformation will be important, and advocacy will be an important component here. Some have said that public health advocates have not been strong enough in dealing with the media and being very clear. Certainly the anti-vaxxers and the anti-vaccine movement, we've been criticized for perhaps not speaking out loud enough. And likely that could be the instance here. So, well, perhaps not being partisan in nature, we need to be able to clearly speak out. And there's so much misinformation and disinformation. So how to do that and get the right messages out will be quite important.
Thank you. I feel like we could talk for the rest of the afternoon, but we have to be mindful of time because we have another panel session with some sensational guests. I think I perhaps just have time for one more question. And I want to go back to Ibrahim, because one of the pieces that the promise of this project really makes clear is that you want to utilize the evidence to produce action and accountability. So what does that look like in real terms? How do we hold governments, and others to account for some of the changes that we would like to see based on the research evidence in this space.
Thank you. So I'll start actually by speaking to all of you in the room and those listening to us online to say, please join us on this really exciting and incredible journey that we're setting out, in particular, as we work with all of you to generate the best science and evidence possible from a very multidisciplinary perspective. As with all global health challenges, this is not unique in that the solutions to the misinformation that has been mentioned, or access to healthcare, or indeed the gender issues, would lie in bringing our best expertise and our best brains to bear on it to come up with the right solutions. And once we do so, then we have a responsibility to achieve the right delivery and implementation, working with all the relevant agencies, whether it's at the global level with the UN agencies or other civil society partners, or at the national level and subnational level in villages and towns across the world. Civil society has a key role to play in that, and we in the Commission, in the Lancet Migration Initiative, what we propose to do is to systematically work with civil society and all the actors to generate the data necessary and appropriate indicators where through our annual reporting mechanisms, we'll be able to show where we're meeting those challenges and where we are not, and work with all of you to challenge governments, to challenge society, to ensure that there's accountability where appropriate. And where we cannot change things, we'll continue to hammer the same message until we get people to listen. Some of that would be that we would need to be a bit more clever, and more of the same is not the answer. And so I would appeal to those of us with expertise in political science, in law, in the social sciences, people that work for media and communication entities, that please get in touch with us. Let's work together to ensure that rather than reacting to messages and misinformation, that we are using the best evidence and driving the narrative, and that we are able to hold everybody to account that chooses to do the wrong thing.
Thank you, Ibrahim. That's fantastic, and actually a perfect way to loop it back to me at the Lancet. In terms of bringing that visibility and offering that platform, we intend to do everything we can to support the mission of this group, and very, very excited to hear about your plans and also your very wide call for participation and collaboration with others. So I'll end the panel there so that we can move on to our next panel session, but all of us will be very happy to take questions during the Q&A after the next panel session. So thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists.
And it's with deep pleasure to welcome you to our second panel session, focusing on the main global opportunities and challenges in the field of migration health, from policy and civil society perspectives. I'm Rachel Burns, a research associate at UCL and the Advocacy and Public Engagement Officer for Lancet Migration. I am delighted to welcome such a diverse panel of migration health experts from across the globe, working from within policy spheres at the national, regional, and international level to operational, on-the-ground work within humanitarian contexts. As you have heard, the key aim of Lancet Migration is to address evidence gaps and drive policy change within the field of migration health. And it's imperative to do this, and it will be essential to have effective collaboration at every stage with policymakers, civil society, and not to mention the migrants themselves. So let's get started. So how this will work is each panelist will give a short intervention from their perspective on the challenges and opportunities within the field of migrant health. I will introduce each panelist prior to their intervention and conclude the session with a final question to the entire panel. Any questions for the panelists from the audience will be taken during the final Q&A. I will work in the semicircle from the right to left, starting. So first, I would like to welcome Ms. Jacqueline Wiekers, Director of the Migration Health Division for the International Organization for Migration.
Thank you, Rachel. Who in the room is foreign born? Who was born outside of the UK or outside of... This is about us. Yes, it's about us. So there are good and bad sides to being a migrant. Huh? Okay, good. First of all, IRM is very proud to be part of this ambitious and much needed effort to make a positive difference for migrants' well-being. The place of migration health within the worlds of health and migration, it is an important and non-negotiable place, and it was very hard to get where we are today because of the unfortunate, rather negative narrative about migration and many misconceptions, as we heard already. Starting with universal health coverage and knowing that many migrants are still left behind, IRM worked tirelessly in the past 2 years with member states and UN agencies like WHO, as well as other partners, to include relevant language into this famous 2019 landmark political declaration on UHC, which explicitly mentions the particular needs of migrants in critical migration situations such as complex emergencies, climate change, international migration of health workers, and so on. Now, on the GCM side, the Global Consultation on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, the landmark recognition that migration is best governed by international cooperation, adopted in 2018 by most governments in the world. Similarly, member states led a series of negotiations with support of UN partners to ensure that health-related commitments and a range of migration health determinants are reflected in this global compact text. For instance, reducing vulnerability in migration, exploitation of labor migrants, detention, access to basic services, social protection, and so on. Moreover, there's a specific mention of the WHO framework on promoting health of refugees and migrants, which is an illustration of constant efforts to ensure multi-sectoral policy engagement. So now the focus is, of course, on the implementation of these global commitments. There is tremendous expectation among governments as well as the UN to work in a unified manner towards supporting member states in the implementation of this global compact on migration. And a UN migration network, of which IOM is the coordinator, has been set up for that particular purpose. Now, with the implementation of these policy networks in mind, it is important to note that the many regional and multi-sectoral policy opportunities beyond the health sector per se for advancing migration health, especially where there is a political will for enhanced international cooperation. For example, among the SADC countries in the African region, or regional bodies like ASEAN, and regional consultative processes on migration that seek solutions for a wide range of migration challenges. For example, access to services, to decent work conditions for migrant workers, protection of vulnerable migrants such as undocumented migrants, coping strategies for the left-behind family members, etc., all of which contribute towards health and well-being and provide an excellent entry point for also the health sector to engage with policymakers across other sectors. Much within the spirit of, following the spirit of this global compact on migration, the IOM Director General, Vitorino, has in his strategic vision for the next 5 years identified migration data as one of the top priority issues. As an operational agency with some 13,000 staff and more than 400 country offices and an annual budget of over 2 billion, 10% of that is approximately on health, we need data to inform our own work. I'd like to finish with a very short example how we work with member states in the development of evidence-based priorities and practices. Just recently, the Lancet published a study of Public Health England in collaboration with other UK researchers and IOM on the effectiveness of pre-entry active tuberculosis and post-entry latent tuberculosis screening in new entrants to the UK. This is about a UK TB program that was established in 2006 with IOM and active in over 60 countries of migrant origin. The bulk of them are, of these operations are run by IOM. Thanks to the visa application-related TB testing of hundreds and thousands of migrants and referral for treatment where needed, the number of migrants diagnosed with TB in the UK decreased since the rollout of this pre-entry TB program. This is just a piece of this very complex study that illustrates a member state, in this case the UK, IOM and academia collaboration to employ evidence and risk-based approaches to address the health of individual migrants as well as the public health of host and destination countries. It also shows how the world is very interconnected. TB in the UK is about TB in the world. I stop here, and I hope we'll have some more minutes, no, seconds later on for some other comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, the speakers, for your insight into migrant inclusion, into the implementation of global health policy, and even kind of insight into regional and sub-regional areas, especially for the UK context. I think that's quite helpful. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Mesfin Tessima, who is the head of the health unit for the International Rescue Committee.
Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about one group of population who is forcefully displaced, which is a population that the International Rescue Committee works with. In terms of number, it's nearly 70.8 million as of 2019. Out of that, 2/3 is internally displaced. But this number is growing, as we speak, even just towards the end of last year, Burkina Faso itself have seen the largest displacement of people driven by conflict, 500,000 people outside the site of, international news. So this, growing challenge in terms of displacement, especially for those who are, forcefully displacement. The drivers are multiple, but also sometimes overlapping. It's a confluence of either climate stress or natural disaster, poverty, or war, and which is basically undermining the international system of categorization of displacement, where the global protection system relies on. Depending on whether you are a refugee or different status, you have a different right. So the mixed migration brought different types of challenge. So, but again, recognizing that the majority of those displaced live in low and middle income countries, and where the same places where resources are scarce and the systems are poorly equipped or to meet their needs. I can give you an example, like Uganda, a country that we work, it hosts nearly 1 million refugees from South Sudan. And despite having a progressive refugee policies that aim to provide health care to refugees, but they are unable to meet the demand because of the resource constraint. So the international community has responsibility to support countries that are bearing the biggest burden in terms of hosting refugees. And again, in many places, even those who have resource, some of them, they are not party to the Refugee Convention, then responsibility and accountability is difficult to ascertain. So it's no surprise that forcibly displaced populations suffer disproportionate high mortality and morbidity. That range from physical injury and psychological trauma. Those who are living, a small portion living in crowded camps, even increased risk of disease outbreak. I was in Thailand recently, and after refugees being there for more than almost 40 years, they still live in makeshift shift, increasing the risk of disease transmission. And again, long-standing camps also now face a significant burden of non-communicable disease, which again brings a different challenge in terms of the kind of care they need, in terms of the cost of care and continuity of care. Outside the camps, those who are living, housing condition, nutrition, and labor condition are some of the drivers of poor health. As a result, these populations suffer high burden of morbidity, mortality. So this context actually, just demand not just providing just aid or more aid. even that, only 65% of humanitarian aid have been made last year. I think what we need is actually better aid that recognize diversity and the different nature of displacement. So financing is one of them, and the donor practice currently where refugee health is seen as acute humanitarian assistance, yet people are living in that kind of situation requiring long-term care for over decades. And again, in terms of service, certainly they do need more than survival, ensuring the well-being and non-communicable disease are also a prevalent situation. And also knowing that what works in contexts like that and what is the most cost-effective types of intervention. So the donor countries must adapt to this reality in a way that we organize our service and provide assistance. So we have those rhetoric around humanitarian development, nexus, bringing the development actors with the humanitarian. But again, unless our institutions and mechanisms adapt to accommodate this reality, I think we'll fail to meet the health needs of those populations. So I welcome actually the Lancet Commission looking at universal health coverage as one of the focus areas, and leveraging the UHC movement would create a platform for demanding equitable access to health service for both displaced people as well as local population. Again, that could help in terms of driving resource and bringing more accountability. With that, I think the importance of data is quite critical to ensure we know what works and how much is directed to that. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. Tassama, for your unique perspective on those challenges of meeting the health needs of those displaced, especially in low middle-income contexts. Next, we have Dr. Santino Severoni, who's a special advisor on migration and health and director of the Division of Health System and Public Health for the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, I would like to structure my 2 points of intervention in addressing challenges and opportunity, building quite a bit on the what we have heard up to now, particularly on the how. Really try to share our experience and to see what we learn from our experience, or what we feel that needs still to be done urgently in order to move the agenda of migration health, particularly in the health sector. I'd like to start by saying that it's interesting, when we started as a WHO to deal with this issue, we realized very soon that the institutional part of the health sector, the Ministry of Health, they were practically off-site on this issue. The public health community was immediately very active, and we can see from the fast-growing and large growing of research and activity, but this was not linked to immediate changes in the health sector. Why that? Well, because there was a misperception of the role of the health sector. Most of the feeling in the health sector were that there is a role only when side effects of the migration process are appearing, which is completely in opposition to what we are preaching as a public health, that health is a founding principle for human well-being, and so productivity, economic impact, and all the rest. So how to do that? That was a big challenge because, in one hand, we were in a similar situation also within WHO. We were lacking basically tools, instruments, to really engage with the health sector. So in one hand, we had to hurry up to fill the gap, to recast the knowledge, the public health knowledge, in order to be able to address the most urgent requests from countries. In the other hand, to move on the agenda, we realized that we're supposed to detach from the rhetoric. As we all know, the political sensitivity is very high, sometimes polarizing. So for us, an important entry point was really to stick to the facts, really to be a resource and to be able to address practical needs or urgent needs of the country. And this has been a very complex process, very political sometimes. The responsiveness of the health sector has been changing according to the political change in the country. But even there, we understood that we're supposed to not to give up, because then later on we learned that even if the overall or the official policy, politics of the country is towards a conservative approach, in reality when we talk about health, we find a lot of attention, a lot of availability to act in the right direction because everybody are concerned for their own health and the health of people around them. So practically, we start to realize that we were needing to develop tools, not only to develop WHO capacity, tools which they were utilized to really go straight away down to the ground and to address the most urgent needs of the countries. We're supposed to start to invest really urgently in sharing knowledge because there is a lot of good experience going on out there and a lot of good practice. And actually we are very good in doing things, but not very good in sharing what we are doing, or at least to use the experience as a base for further scientific development or research development. So it was very important for us to enable knowledge sharing, and for that we invested into establishing a WHO summer school on migration health, where many colleagues in this room, they are teaching, they are our guests and teaching every year. For whom this school, we wanted to really invest in tackling and creating a critical mass of decision makers, those which are sitting on the side of the table where they are having easy access to decision, very little action to look at the reality on the ground. The last two elements where we invested, policy development. We realized that without a framework, without a clear vision, we could not move forward. And research. Research probably is the most important area in the action we are undertaking today within WHO. And the element of policy to provide the country with a policy framework and clear priority for action have been very useful also for the research, because helped us to direct the research towards really concrete needs of the country and to tailor tools and to fill the gap between evidence and the use of this evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a wonderfully practical example of how kind of the marriage of research and policy within a regional context and how fruitful that can be. So thank you very much. I would next like to introduce Dr. Sy Karashi, who's the Chancellor for the Institute of Integrated Learning and Management University and former Chief Election Commissioner of India. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, among the medicos, I'm the only fake doctor. But you can't do without me also, because probably the solution lies with me. You discuss the problem. And I'm, of course, speaking more from the Indian context, because that's all I know. We represent 1/5 of the world humanity, as you know. 1 in every 3 Indians is a migrant. And there are 2 types of migrants, those who come abroad and those who are within the country, and they're treated differently. I was very impressed by the opening speaker who almost spoke the language I wanted to speak. The way they were either demonized or politicized or neglected, and that is the whole story. Now, when you go abroad, you are a pampered lot, because you run into good money, you are sending remittances, you have changed India's economy, the way they're trying to woo you. And within the country, the way they neglect and treat you in very subhuman conditions. Obviously, the migration within the country is from the poorest states to the richest states. And that is where they are looked down upon. And the two sources, the biggest sources are UP and Bihar. UP has the population of Brazil, one state, and Bihar is a big state too. And the biggest recipients are Maharashtra and Delhi. And among the various, I'm not going into figures for a good reason. Now, women outnumber men, that is one thing. And the plight of women as migrants is something we have to be particularly conscious about. Last census, 2011, showed that there are 2,613 slums. The development of slums in the towns is the first result of the migration, where 65 million Indians lived in 14 million households. Now, what was the situation there? 30% households had no toilet. 10% no electricity, 4% no drinking water, 63% no closed drainage. And then the migrants have a problem of proving their identity. They're outsider, they cannot open bank account, and they are treated very badly. Now, within the country also there are two types of migrants. There are seasonal migrants and those who have migrated for job. Seasonal migrants have extra problems because they're only for the say agricultural season 2-3 months, so they cannot even change their voting the right from the home state to the other place, and they are not even allowed to live in these slums. The rents in these slums, which are uninhabitable anyway, are exorbitant for us. So these guys are streetless, homeless. They sleep on the pavement, and every other day we hear the news when a drunken Richie Rich is driving his car, he runs over some of these guys who are sleeping on the pavement. So that is the situation. Now, public health, of course, is the biggest concern for the migrants. Because of the overcrowding, we have infectious diseases, poor nutritional status, inadequate quantities of and poor quality of water, poor environmental sanitation. These are the problems. Now, the morbidity patterns, their living conditions and health behaviors increase their susceptibility to infectious diseases such as malaria, hepatitis, typhoid, respiratory infections. And in case of malaria, not only they suffer from malaria, they also transport malaria to their destination, and they create the conditions which are favorable to mosquitoes. Migrants are 6 times more likely to have tuberculosis, twice as much vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, and occupation-related issues also are wide-ranging, almost virtually the entire list on your health menu: cold, cough, fever, diarrhea, tiredness, lack of appetite, giddiness, weight loss, stomach pain, headache, pain in the neck, swelling of legs, and so on and so forth. Mothers and children and reproductive and mental health are the special health issues. Now, these slum development and the regularization of the slum has become the political issue, which is where perhaps the solution lies. Because when these people are almost 30 to 40% of the 25 to 30% of the voters, politicians recognize them only as voters. They recognize nothing else. So if they're voters, so the debate is now most of these migrants are happy to keep their name in the voter list back home. But the power which they need, the political power which they need is here. If they do not register as voters, nobody will bother about them. So we try to educate them in the election commission that you register yourself. The law of the land is that if you are living at a place for more than 6 months, normally resident for more than 6 months, you register here. Your name will be struck off from your home, and when you go back, it will be reversed. So that is what we need to do. Now, to deal with this political exclusion, we have certain suggestions to make. Politicians, since they recognize them only as voters, we should educate these people about their voting rights. We should facilitate their registration at the doorstep. We should motivate them to vote without fail, and then educate them about their health needs and encourage them to demand these as a matter of right from politicians. And finally, we teach the politicians the problems of the migrant health, and we should tell them that their manifestos should essentially contain these issues and the solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Karashi. And you make a really important point, because I think often we speak about international migrants or refugees, and I think actually a really important point is the internal migrant and how they get integrated into political systems and how that affects their access to healthcare. So thank you so much for that perspective. And finally, I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Apostolos Vicious, Director of Medical Operational Support Unit for Medecins Frontières, Greece.
Well, thank you very much. And being the last, of course, is the difficult part, because you have been hearing all this story, and then the last one probably you are tired to hear about. Well, it's important, first of all, to talk to converted people. And I think listening to different speeches, you could catch different words that we probably had the same thing. The question is how far we preach about it. That's another question. In most of my presentation, normally I use slides and pictures, because as we say, probably in English, they say, I'm not an English one, a picture, it's worth 1,000 words. But I decided this time, not only because the colleagues, they said no pictures, as a part of the discussion, but I decided this time, even if I would bring pictures, I would decide to bring black pictures. What means black picture? It means nothing. Why that? I'm coming, first of all, from a beautiful country, it's called Greece. You probably know the Greek salads and the Greek islands for the holidays. But also you don't know that at the moment, or you know, some of you know, now we will learn more, there are at the moment 42,000 humans, children, women and men who are stranded in the Greek islands. And when we talk about migrants and refugees, we have to talk about people on the move and people stranded, humans. Because migrants and refugees are legal status. First of all, they're human beings that they need to eat, to drink, to sleep, to have access to health like each of us. I think that's an important element, that we forget that beyond the numbers are human beings. I wanted to bring black pictures because the definition of health, and we have WHO here, is not existing. And everybody knows the definition of what's health for WHO. Physical, mental health and well-being is not existing. To address the issue of public health, there's another black picture, it's not existing. Then I will explain to you why it's not existing. These 42,000 people are living in a space for 6,000 people. There is one toilet for 300 people. There is one shower for 500 people. 3/4 of this community are living in the streets. 35% of them are children. 15% are unaccompanied minors. When you have children coming to your clinic telling you that I want to die, when you have children bleeding because they've been attempting to squeeze suicide and saying, I don't want to go back, better I die. When you have people for 6 months, since 11th of July until yesterday, stopped accessing healthcare, that means that these people are destined to die or to suffer. And this is a political choice. Today, we're not just treating people because of diseases. Diseases that we're treating today in the Greek islands and in the mainland are created because of these policies. The European government are investing millions, and already at the moment 2.23 billion euros are appointed to Greece from 2015 to 2020 to take care of these people, and this money is not being used. These are being contained in the islands on suffering. We've been seeing death every day. Nobody talks anymore because death becomes now a normal and a normality. People are becoming victims of sexual violence. Nobody talks about that because that's part of normality. In this situation, if I were to talk about other countries, maybe it would be exotic and you'd think, these poor countries. No, this is a political choice. That's one. And I think at the moment we need to talk about it. And I think the problem today, and that is I'm shocked about, our society are suffering of indifference. As MSF, we talk about vaccinating the population, not against the coronavirus. We have the virus already of indifference in our societies. But what gets shocking for me more, my colleagues, medical doctors, nurses, midwives, psychologists all around the world, they're listening and they're seeing the situation. And I wish that all of them, at least they will say, not on our name. Can this happen next to, in Europe, in the most richest continent? Is this possible today, in 2020, we are living this such situation? This has to stop. And in order to stop that, I think we need to name and shame our governments who are signing universal coverage documents and they are very happy and they are promoting it, etc., while in reality they are not implementing what they've been to do. Because they are differentiating. Yesterday, finally, this, after pressure of MSF and other organizations, the government decided to give health back. But now health is being linked with the political and legal status. From the moment a person loses the asylum system or asylum seeker system, then he is stopped of the health care. It is not, it is true that in 2019 and 20, we have children born HIV positive in Greece because pregnant women were stopped ARVs because they cannot have access. This is 2020, and we talk about coronavirus. A coronavirus that may come. We are having today people suffering and we do nothing. And when coronavirus will come, of course, we'll mobilize all around the world because we don't care about migrants and refugees. We care about our bodies. And I think we need to give an end to this story, and I hope the Lancet at least will convince the medical doctors to come in front of that, the medical doctors, I mean all the medical community, in order to convince the society that migrants and refugees are human beings, and health, as WHO says, cannot be seen separately from migrant and refugee health. But in order not to remain a slogan, we need to take an action. And an action has to be yesterday. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Apostolos, for a harrowing insight into the realities of people on the move and, as you said, stranded. So thank you all. I kind of wanted to kind of move to this next section of, with all this in mind, I'm curious to know from each of you, in terms of practical steps and kind of thinking within the context of Lancet Migration collaboration, what would be one or two key recommendations for how policy, academia, and civil society can work together more effectively within the field of migration and health? And I think we can start, I'm not sure where the other mic is, but maybe we could just start with Apostolos and then, oh yeah, okay. Jacqueline, we can work down. Thank you.
Hi, am I on? Yeah. Well, difficult to speak after you. You've said a lot. So I think starting this last question is, policies do not seem to follow evidence. There is a disconnect. It may be an understatement, actually. For example, evidence says it's much cheaper to include migrants in primary healthcare and health systems. Yes, yet they continue to be excluded. We all know. Academia has been well underlining the problems, vulnerabilities, gaps, and maybe less strong in showing solutions that somehow speak to our policymakers. So can academia do better in showing where solutions are, such as how to finance migrant health, including focus on states with weak health systems, involve other sectors in studies? What about migration and labor? Include private sector and migrants as active stakeholders in a topic that is basically about their well-being and their challenges, and they are the drivers of development. Look at you all. You are going to come up with solutions, no? And most of all, involving all relevant regions of the world. So to be fit for purpose, we should, one, be guided by migration-related realities and evidence. Migrants connect all regions of the world. I already said that. Challenges in China, Horn of Africa, are the business of everybody. And migrants are not all going from the poor to the rich parts of the world forever and ever. The complex flows of people going back and forth demands great innovation in ways to engage with migrants, connect health systems across and between regions, and develop social protection mechanisms that are in sync with transnational realities, and so on. Second, engaging with policymakers in low and middle income countries, we must underline that are faced with the bulk of migration challenges, including also the health burden. This is a must if the research agenda is to have a true impact on advancing the global migration health agenda. So looking at the Lancet Migration future agenda, as we heard today, and based on IOM's experience in migration, including all the health access barriers, linkages with SDGs, environment and climate change, and so on, IOM looks much forward to a deep engagement with the Lancet Migration. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
I think one practical suggestion is that, just following with what I said earlier, in terms of, the health challenge for, again, displaced and forcefully displaced, including refugee and internally displaced, understanding, the different dynamics of health depending on their migration situation, whether, they have lived in a camp for a long time or acute displacement living in unsanitary condition. If we don't have a good data to understand all this, then our response will be reactionary, always the same thing to do, as if they only need, certain types of service. So I was, recently in Thailand and Bangladesh, and the Rohingyas, displacement is kind of, tell a story that when you have myth and rumor that victimize certain population, then the kind of response mechanism that comes with that is that it's kind of punitive types of response. So there has been a rumor in, Bangladesh that the Rohingyas have been too many children. And then the response was, we need to introduce family planning as a control measure. And perhaps whether that was based on evidence, I don't think so. There was no data to back it up. So I think a great way of partnership between academia, civil society, NGOs, and policies, really to have better quality data to inform decision making. Also, advocacy for better protection of vulnerable population. Thank you.
Yes, well, I like to start by saying that the gap between evidence and the use of this evidence for formulation of a solid policy is not a prerogative only of the immigration health sector. We see this every day in the health sector. Every time we are walking into a Ministry of Health room, we see the shelves full of beautiful policy never implemented or never utilized, or evidence never utilized. So the issue here is how to encourage the health sector, those taking the decision to utilize this evidence. Well, in my view, there are two conditions. One is to really utilize what we have information, evidence that works, because we know how to make it happen. We know we have already utilized in other contexts, and we can really induce the utilization of this evidence in order to fill this gap, bridge this gap between the evidence research and the utilization of those informations. But then there is the political choice. You heard just before. Political choice is there. Again, if I'm drawing on my humble, small experience in this past year in the region, I would tell you that it's a very difficult process, but we're never supposed to give up as a public healther to try to depoliticize our action. Wherever we are allowing to politicians to use our efforts, our means, our evidence for political purpose, we are losing the battle. We need to really walk the talk, really go straight to the fact, really to address practical problems. And my experience have been that even in situations where the overall political atmosphere, landscape is not that encouraging, actually things can change.
Thank you. My point is, again, that politics is the key to the whole problem. And there we suffer from kind of double standards. When we have 30 MPs of Indian origin and so many senators, we are delighted. When there are 4 ministers in Canada and 1 former prime minister, we are happy. When there are 2 potential candidates for US presidency, we are delighted. But the migrants coming into India are described as locusts who have to be identified, killed and thrown out. So we need to shed that, and we have to deal with the politicians first. We have to make them understand it's a human problem and they have to deal with it as such. And also at the same time sensitize the migrants themselves about their rights, their political rights, because that holds the key. And finally, I would say that the reorientation and training of the doctors themselves. They are the guys who refuse to go to those slums, and because the conditions are not so nice. And they had taken an oath of service, but they forget about it. So maybe a little bit of a look at the reorientation of the doctors also perhaps is needed.
Well, the dynamics that we face and the institutions we represent are different, and I understand that we cannot be the same, neither we can work the same, and we need to understand each other. So I think joining better forces and seeing who can do what, I think that's an important element. Of course, I don't ask anybody to be like MSF, providing medical care and speaking out, but still we can join forces and do things better. Now, when it comes to academia, because most of just to give you an example, in 2016, European Commission called all the academia to do research about what to do about migration and health. And the questions that were discussed for 2 days on the meeting were the same questions and the same answers that were discussed 5 years ago, etc. But still academia participated in programs, and they discuss with the universities and they present to each other. The point is not just to discuss among each other. The point is to go beyond that, to go beyond these borders and tell to my mother Because if Professor Santino comes and says like this, he says he's right, he's a professor, he's WHO. You are an NGO, etc. And why I'm saying that? Because another element that we need to do today, and we need to protect today, in addition to the dignity of people, because it costs nothing, and dignity of people today is another black slide. Today, what is in danger is solidarity. Today in Greece, for example, NGOs and group of people who are assisting refugees, the only one, because the state is not present, are being today criminalized. MSF was criminalized to save lives in the sea. Solidarity is not, and will never be a crime. Seeking safety is not a crime. We don't need to look at migration and refugee health, something separate from health. If we look at as a part of the community, as a human being with needs, acute and chronic needs, the problem is solved. Why do we need to look at a special component of it? I think today we have enough resources in the international community, and I think we have a lot of gaps for many issues on health. We can make our life better if we prioritize the needs of our people. So in that case, I think joining forces and still to convert more and more, but I think it's important to preach. And I think to preach properly using the tools and hope maybe, most probably, inshallah, the Lancet will be the tool probably convincing better the people. So the next year we'll have more people in this room, more people around the world, and more politicians being convinced that this story has to end. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think that kind of sums it all together quite nicely, is that there's really a need for a collaboration, and that's what we're hoping to bring together with Lancet Migration, and also this underlying theme of solidarity. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for offering your invaluable perspectives and input, and we are going into the final part of the launch, but they will all be around following the event for more discussion. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more about the political issue this, and the access to healthcare has become a very hot political issue in India at the moment. I was just wondering if you could comment on what you think, whether the Ayushman Bharat health reforms of the Prime Minister will adequately cover the health needs of migrants, and also maybe comment on the different approach being adopted by the Delhi state government to the Mohalla clinics, which is a much more universal entitlement with no registration. Anyone can get healthcare. So which model do you think is going to be more effective in migrants?
I think the Ayushman scheme of the Prime Minister is a very good scheme, no doubt, and it will reach lots of people. But then there is a human element, whether it will honestly reach everybody or they will be selective in taking into the people. The Mohalla Clinic of Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi is a brilliant scheme. And I'm afraid that they were not allowed to implement it at the speed they wanted to do it. But it has been appreciated worldwide, it has been appreciated by the court. Just go around the corner and there is a free medical care available to everybody. And that is really what Prime Minister used to call Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, with everyone and for everyone's development. Actually, this Mohalla Clinic, the neighborhood clinic, is doing a great job indeed.
So I'm going to take 3 questions together, so we'll hold them and then the speakers will answer. Yes. Yes, the lady in the white polo neck.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Becky, I'm a PhD student at UCL, and my question is more specific around the sort of climate change key topic that was mentioned. Of course, we know that climate change is not only influencing migration patterns, but it's also resulting in trafficking and non-migration events, not only in humanitarian situations, but also due to longer-term environmental changes in the creation of poverty traps. Of course, trapped populations are highly vulnerable with lots of specific healthcare needs, particularly around access.
Thank you. And the lady at the back in the green shirt.
Hello, my name's Raya Feldman. I have been working for a very small British charity called Maternity Action on issues to do with undocumented pregnant women and visitors to the UK being charged for maternity care. And really, I don't know to whom I should direct my question, but it's actually about the collaboration and about the way this collaboration might engage grassroots organizations. Actually, Maternity Action itself is not a grassroots organization, but it's a very small advocacy charity that campaigns on migrant women's access to maternity care, among other things. I'm also involved with an even smaller and more obscure charity that gives advice largely to undocumented migrants in London. And I think and I've been in the past working in academic institutions as well. And it sounds very good to have a collaboration between civil society and academics and health workers. The issue is to put it into practice and act, because it's much easier to assemble academics and senior health workers and senior policy people discussing sectoral health policy than it is actually to hear what's happening on the ground. And I think the issues of trying to gather information about the harms that affect migrants. I really know only about migrants in this country, and particularly in the context of the hostile environment, and particularly in relation to healthcare, the absolute iniquity of the charging programme for NHS care. But I think it would be it's really a proposal that I'd like a response to. I think it would be really useful in the documentation in this collaboration to have somebody whose job it is to engage with small civil society organisations through which, and that includes community organisations that don't particularly have a policy orientation, through which they can actually meet both people working on the ground and also migrants, in order then to have some systematic way of reporting. For instance, in the little charity that I'm involved with, Hackney Migrant...
I'm so sorry, thank you so much. We've only got about 10 minutes. Thank you so much. I will ask one of the Commission members to thank you for your valuable input. Could I have one more question? Yes, just in the middle here.
What I actually wanted to ask is if there's any country or any nation state or any region that is actually attending to the needs of the health needs of migrant people already, so that we can be guided by a region that's doing it right and see if we can bring out a best practice model on what to adopt. I've listened severally to Turkey sort of applaud itself, but I wonder what you all think as researchers of the Turkish model of looking after migrants. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those excellent questions. Could I ask Mesfin or Ibrahim to answer the first one on climate change and trapping? Could I ask Bernadette to answer the second question, please, around grassroots engagement? And Jacqueline, could I ask you to address the last one on nation states?
Thank you for that question on the climate change. I think that's very complex, of course, one of the drivers of migration, certainly, and also poverty. One of visible example that I have, which I witness, is in the Lake Chad region of the Sahel, where many countries share the same region, including Chad, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon, and with climate change, the regression of the lake chart, the livelihood of people dependent on around that area has been depleted over years. And that led, into increased poverty. And with the growth of population, of course, and youth, with lack of opportunities, I think that leads to all sorts of, extremism and violence. And of course, unfortunately, the coping mechanism is to engage on more violent types of strategy. And many of you who've lived in that region, when the northern Nigeria, crisis happened with Boko Haram, the pretext you hear is a religious pretext. In fact, that is probably what's being, written in the headline. But the major driver why people are going is a livelihood, it's a coping. And so I think unless we understand all these dynamics, then we may be kind of treating the symptom. So I think the point is, people need, of course, adaptation for the new reality. And that includes, livelihood option for youth, and as well as looking at, mitigation measures. So I think understanding those and in the whole aspect of displacement and conflict, I think that would give us a better insight, even to respond to the situation like, the Lake Chad region. But I think that's where research and is valuable to understand all of this driver. And, it's rightly fully correct, the Commission to look at climate change as a key driver of migration and to understand, those through academic and civil society partnership. I think that is something that we really interested to, engage as well. Thank you.
So I'll just add briefly to that in terms of how we are going to address that. And would like to say that acknowledging that there are implications and that this subject is complex, implications of people left behind or who are trapped and therefore unable to move, we purposely are going to be working on this particular tract with Lancet Countdown on Climate Change Project. So that working group would actually be a joint one, and we would look at both populations that move and those that cannot move, and the implications on that.
Okay, there's no easy answer to your question, but as the saying goes, it takes two to tango. So what we're going to have to do is change the way we work, which is academics and researchers have definitely got to leave the ivory tower. And anybody who works in migration research has already left the ivory tower, because otherwise you can't work in this field. So that's the first thing. And also that we learn to get to know each other, and that means that the grassroots organizations and other civil society actors have to also take the step forward and say, we're here, we're doing this. So they have to make themselves known, and researchers and academics have to go and be part of the work that is being done in the community. So I think the key thing is really looking at what is going on in the community and working together, because academics and researchers and grassroots organizations all meet each other at the community level. So I think that is one of the ways that we can really try to know about each other and work together. We haven't been very good at it, and I think it's both sides. So I really hope that through our collaboration, and it varies very much. Some local, regional initiatives are very good, and they have an overview and they know each other. Other places we're not as good, and I think we'll just have to get better through this global collaboration. So as you know, I mentioned it earlier, we have a mailing list, and there's going to be a website. So, just please tell other people, join us and join the collaboration. I think that's the only thing I can say at the moment, and I hope that many more people will then do that and talk to each other about each other.
It's on. So with respect to the last question on the good practices, I think it's a very important point, and it's something that very much also speaks to what the Global Compact on Migration is trying to reach, to engage in dialogues with different sectors and countries and come up with, so what did work. Also WHO has done quite some work on it, and as well IOM, we try to really be a platform also for governments to share such good practices. Of course, I cannot blame and name countries, I will not do that, but what is very important to realize when you think of good practices is that there are many countries that are, for instance, the UK may see itself as a country of destination mainly. Maybe that's the case today. It was not the case a while back. But okay, there are also a lot of countries of origin in the world that have a very particular interest in seeing their nationals go abroad. They have an incredible dependence on the remittances that are sent back by their nationals back home. Very important, lots of money, 600 billion a year, according to the World Bank. So they have a great interest in also ensuring the health and well-being of their nationals is taken care of when they are abroad. So they come up with possibly very innovative, and they do come up with innovative solutions. Some of them are very well developed, others are less well developed, but they do exist. Then there are countries that are countries of origin as well as destination. They are both at the same time. And they're realizing that yes, they want to make sure that their nationals are taken care of abroad, and they are trying to also do the right thing for the nationals that are coming to their country, realizing you have to also practice what you preach. So these do exist. To really sum things up, bilateral arrangements are very important. It's very important that countries connect with one another, plan things, discuss things, and come with solutions prepared, so that indeed migration can be happening in as we say, in an orderly fashion, and not ad hoc and unplanned with the risk of very negative migration outcomes. Another issue to bear in mind is there are more and more financial solutions. Finance is a big issue. The cost is often the biggest reason to not address the health of migrants, for good and bad reasons. There are some innovative finance solutions in the world today that also apply to especially apply to the weaker health systems in the world and the so-called complex operating environments. Think of the Global Fund. Also, hopefully, think of more and more Gavi when we think of migration populations. These are very important developments, and I hope that the work that some agencies, including IOM, are doing together with these big finance mechanisms are finding a way to further develop and become good practices. They can go a long way. I'll stop here, but very good point. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we only have time for one or two more questions, I'm afraid, and then we will be available at the end for the discussion and questions individually. So if there's any further questions. Yes, here at the front.
Hello, James Smith, MSF. Data and evidence, lots of talk about data and evidence and the need for more data and evidence. My question is to Ibrahim, but also to Paul. I've engaged Paul on this via social media, so he perhaps knows what I'm going to now say. Is this indeed our leading differential diagnosis, the absence of data and evidence? With the exception of big gaps in terms of implementation research, data and evidence don't really, from my perspective, the questions of values and morality are not amenable to more data and more evidence. And I wonder indeed whether we can speak to some of what I think we've skirted around in relation to values, morality, and politics in migration and health.
Thank you. And I'm afraid one further question. I think there's a lady just here in the middle at the back.
So I'm really interested in sort of this framing of immigration, particularly around sort of the there we go. I mean, really, it's around the securitization of immigration and subsequent dehumanization of the people we're actually talking about. So this is this need for sort of changing the frame, and I think we all understand that facts are not enough, even though they're very beautiful. It depends on a very rational decision maker who wants to listen to you and has time and is informed. So I was wondering if there were particular strategies with the Lancet Migration on engaging on sort of the political economy of migration, of these important stakeholders. And you mentioned working with the media, but if there are any particular strategies already behind that, and I might be a bit tricky at this sort of inception stage, but I would really like to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think I'll let our three co-chairs actually decide which of those questions to answer, if that's okay.
Thanks, James. That's why I unfriended you on social media, because yes, we're in an interesting time, and I think in a way the two questions are related, because it's what's clear. I'll speak from now a U.S. sense, is that certainly data is not enough. That's for sure. How we deal, and so I haven't answered your question directly, except to say that there needs to be. Actually, I'll give you an example. We were talking about one of the projects that we want to do as soon as possible is to look at detention and the conditions in detention. And it came out very quickly that we don't want these people in detention. They shouldn't be there. So again, an ethical issue. Should we be looking at the detention, or should we just say, no, we're not going to look at it and say that people shouldn't be in detention? I hope the answer is that we will look at it, because since it's a reality that they are in detention, we want to have the best conditions while speaking out. One example. For the question, we're probably not there yet, but I'll give a specific example of what we're doing at my university that may be a way to move forward, is working with politicians who are on the side of migrants and advocacy and data. So, for example, we worked with a congresswoman who holds the purse strings for Health and Human Services, and we helped her examine the conditions in these detention centers. We helped her to give talking points of why flu vaccine is a good idea to give to migrants when they cross over from Mexico. And whether it's made a difference, we'll see. It's certainly received a lot of positive media attention from that, and groups have been formed to address that. Perhaps you, and then Ibrahim.
Okay, I think the question that you asked about how we can engage better, one of the things is, it's been talked about that we shouldn't give up, and we have no plans of doing that. But the other thing is to really persevere, because it's a game of seeing who tires out first, particularly with the politicians and with the media. So I think one of the things is that often it is tiring, it is not easy, and if you're not getting any response, you tend not to continue or not do anything. So one of the things that we're going to have to do is to really persevere, and the other thing is to actually engage with people who have completely different views from us, and which is also a big challenge, because it's always easier to talk to the choir or the converted. And I think that's going to be one of the things that we have to do. And for that, you need more than data, because they're definitely not interested in data, or if they look at data, they want to look at it differently. And there are many strategies to do this. But I think one of the things that we also have to study, and Jacqueline was just talking about the good practices. We know there are countries, we know there are municipalities, we know there are places where people have managed to do that. And the thing is that instead of looking at the big, ugly places where things are really bad, I think we have to go back and look and say, how did they succeed? Because very often we look at only what didn't work. But I think it's also a question of what did work, and that's one of the things we're going to do in our work. And the documentation is there, but we have to work further to see what worked. The last thing I'd like to say is that we don't have universal solutions that what might have worked in one setting will work in another setting. So how you engage with politicians, civil society, media, even though one would think they're uniform all over the world because of globalization, they're not. There are cultural differences. There are differences that are related to that particular context. And I think that's one of the things that also we're going to do with our regional networking, collaboration, and engagement. So I think that's going to be really important.
So I kind of think that my two co-chairs have answered the two questions, which I agree are interrelated. And if you permit me, Miriam, and I know you're going to thank everybody else, so I'll use this opportunity to say thank you very much for putting together this lunch, to Luham and to Esther, who may or may not be in the room, and others that have helped with the microphones. Thank you very much for setting us on this fantastic journey. Let's hope we reconvene in a few months' time to launch the first output of this. Thank you indeed.
Thank you.
I'd just like to finish by saying, first of all, thank you to the Lancet, to Richard Horton and to Jocelyn Clark, who have been such a key and integral part of our journey to this state, and I know will be such a key, integral part of our journey as we move forward. But then also, many of our speakers, and I'm sure many of you, but many of our speakers have come from a very long way to be with us today. And really, I think what we tried to do with this event, which marks the start of a journey for Lancet Migration, is to bring together the academic, the operational, the policy perspectives. And I think that we really have been honoured to have such amazing speakers from so many different backgrounds, and I know that this is the start of a very positive collaboration, and also with many of you. So I would like to ask everyone to have a look and sign up to our mailing list. There's details on the side of the room for signing up to the mailing list. There are also other ways of getting engaged with us, and we will be here at the front for a while, and then in the drinks reception we would be pleased to connect with you and talk with you further, or connect via email, whether it's connecting with our regional hubs, whether it's connecting more with our research. But finally, just please put your hands together for our wonderful speakers.